Climate change can be seen as an externality by our industries, a cost that is not financially incurred by producers and companies. Instead, the real cost is borne by communities and people whose property, livelihood, and even lives are swept away in unexpected super-typhoons and out-of-season droughts. But is there any recourse for those affected? Who should be held accountable for global climate change, and how? This is the story of the National Inquiry on Carbon Majors. It is a novel attempt to hold large, multinational companies in one petition centered around the effect of climate change on human rights. On September 22, 2015, Greenpeace Southeast Asia, the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement, along with other interest groups, filed a petition with the Commission on Human Rights Philippines, or the CHR, demanding for an investigation of the possible human rights violations of 47 companies collectively known as carbon majors in the context of increased reports of disaster-related casualties, particularly the devastation that Super Typhoon Yolanda had in 2013, which resulted in the death of more than 6,000 people. The petition posits that climate change interferes with Filipinos' enjoyment of fundamental rights, and thus those contributing to climate change must be made accountable. Based on 3 peer-reviewed publications, these carbon majors were identified as companies that produce the largest cumulative global carbon dioxide and methane emissions. The petition submits that the carbon majors should be held accountable for the following violations or threats of violations of Filipinos' rights, with special attention to marginalized and disadvantaged people and communities: right to life, right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, right to food, right to water, right to sanitation, right to adequate housing, and right to self-determination. During the preliminary conference on December 11, 2017, the CHR asserted its authority to conduct the national inquiry. The Commission's exercise of its jurisdiction was based on the doctrine of competence de la competence, under which the Commission can determine the scope of its own jurisdiction, its own omnibus rules of procedure, the 1987 Philippine Constitution, specifically Sections 18, paragraphs 6 and 7, which give the Commission a broad mandate to recommend to Congress measures to promote human rights and to monitor the government's compliance with international treaty obligations, and established Philippine Supreme Court's jurisprudence that the right to a balanced and healthful ecology and the correlative obligations to which this right attach are self-executing. Citing the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change AR5, the petition argued that the projected impacts of anthropogenic climate change include the following: increase in global average temperatures, which are likely to increase from 1.5 to 2.3 degrees Celsius by 2050, increased precipitation that will likely lead to flood hazards, droughts, and reduced water resources, sea level rise, which will adversely impact coastal systems and low-lying areas through increased frequency of flooding, erosion, and saltwater intrusion, impaired ecosystems, which will reduce the populations, vigor, and viability of many species, damage to buildings, infrastructure, and services due to extreme weather events and sea level rise, expanding disease vectors due to the increase in heavy rain and temperature. Additionally, ocean acidification was also identified as a direct consequence of increased carbon dioxide emissions. As carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it decreases the ocean's pH level, which affects the formation and dissolution of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons in a range of marine species that form the base of marine food chains. The main issue of the petition is whether or not carbon majors are accountable for the human rights implications of climate change and ocean acidification. Carbon majors have responsibilities to ensure that their products do not contribute to the human rights impacts, impairments, infringements, abuses, and violations from climate change. They also have the responsibility to provide remedy and redress in case these violations occur. The UNGP implements UN's Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. The following UNGP principles are invoked by the petitioners. Principle 13 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs, provides that each business is expected to respect human rights regardless of its size or sector. The petitioners cited the enterprise theory of corporate personhood, which provides that activities of the whole group of companies should pertain to the parent entity. Citing Principle 13 of the UNGP, petitioners claim that the carbon majors' activities have contributed to a consistently elevated level of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon majors were aware of threats of climate change for decades, yet they have engaged in activities that undermine climate science and action. Citing Principle 17 of the UNGP, the carbon majors are required to exercise human rights due diligence that is ongoing and involves consultation with affected groups and relevant stakeholders.
As for the states where the carbon majors are incorporated, they have obligations to protect the human rights of Filipinos, including the duty to prevent harm by third parties under international law. The no harm principle provides that states are responsible for transboundary pollution. This principle is recognized under customary international law. In the ICJ advisory opinion on the threat or use of nuclear weapons, the International Court of Justice stated that states have the general obligation to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction and control respect the environment of other states or of areas beyond national control. The no harm principle has also been subsequently codified in the 1972 Stockholm Declaration and the 1992 Rio Declaration. The petitioners also argue that under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a state's failure to take appropriate measures or to exercise due diligence to prevent, punish, investigate, or redress the harm caused by private entities in relation to the environment could give rise to violations of the covenant. They further argue that this obligation is also found under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Under this covenant, state parties have to respect the enjoyment of the right to health in other countries and to prevent third parties from violating the right in other countries. The petitioners then prayed for the CHR to take notice of the investor-owned carbon majors' contribution to CO2 emissions and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to investigate the human rights implications of climate change and ocean acidification and the resulting rights impacts in the Philippines, and to issue a finding on the responsibility of the investor-owned carbon majors for human rights threats and violations in the Philippines. They also prayed for the CHR to monitor communities that are acutely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and to recommend to policymakers and legislators to take appropriate actions regarding this matter. They also prayed for the CHR to request from the respondents a submission of plans on how to mitigate such violations resulting from the impacts of climate change and how they will be remedied and prevented in the future, and to recommend that governments in the Philippines and other countries where the investor-owned carbon majors are domiciled to fulfill the international duty of cooperation to address the human rights implications of climate change. 6 years after the filing of the petition, the CHR has not yet issued a resolution. After the parties have submitted their pleadings, a total of 6 inquiry hearings have already been conducted in Manila, London, and New York. Nevertheless, the fight for climate justice continues. The petitioners have already filed 2 urgent motions for the urgent resolution of the petition. They have mentioned that 3 of the petitioners have already died without seeing the outcome of their fight for climate justice. On December 9, 2021, ahead of the International Human Rights Day, climate activists, typhoon survivors, farmers, and fisherfolk trooped to the CHR to demand the issuance of the long-delayed resolution. The petitioners claim in their motions that the delay in the issuance of the report is a disservice to the Filipino communities and climate survivors who continue to suffer from the impacts of the climate crisis. According to Carlito Baclagon from 350.org, decisive climate action from the Commission on Human Rights is long overdue. We hope that this time around, they will act with the kind of urgency that the climate crisis demands.